All seen that flag? Here it is. Made in New Zealand, not China. Took a bit to find one that was made in New Zealand. Very good quality these are actually. These are made by a small company down in Dunedin called Adams Flags. Okay? They're available online. I think they're, if you're buying them individually, they're around about $100. Okay? And they are good quality. So this was the flag that represented, or that the documents come to represent. Because it's a little bit hard waving a piece of paper up in the air and you're trying to read it. So we have symbols. And symbology can also be used for nefarious purposes as well. So here we have the Red Cross here in the middle. Now the Red Cross, a lot of people call it the George Cross. The Red Cross was around a long time before anybody called George. It's an ancient symbol. My understanding, it's always been the mark of the sovereign, and it means from the four winds, from the four corners of the earth, the blood of humanity flows together as one. We're one. We're the human family. You know? That's why we can interbreed. 4 stars representing the Southern Cross, with again the mark of the sovereign in between them, which says this is the place for the sovereign to stand. What happened in the 28 years in the run-up to 1835, where this document was internationally recognised, was the negotiations that were going on between the parties, and that was between our European ancestors and the ancestors of the native people of the Tupu. Right? And once you get into the document, because there's a lot of mistranslations around, of both documents actually, there's a lot of mistranslations around. I don't translate documents, I interpret them. Okay? So, one of the reasons that our founding documents, or the documents of our constitutions, were written in the native tongue is because it's internationally recognised that that in the native tongue shall prevail. In other words, it does away with the deception and trickery of things like legalese. Right? Which, when we have a conversation outside, is, again, I don't hold a candle or any substance to legalese. Legalese is a language of an association. I'm not of that association. So it has no impact upon me. My native tongue is natural and ordinary English. So I just pick up an English dictionary and have a look at it. Right. And I cannot find anywhere where legalese is actually a recognised language in this territory. We have 3 today: English, natural and ordinary, and sign. Where does legalese come into it? So the first, this document, which is often, and still is, often referred to as a Declaration of Independence. Now that started right in 1834 when the flag was actually gazetted in the Sydney Gazette. And they started calling it a declaration right from that time. You need to understand what was actually transpiring. At that time, and this is where we get a lot of confusion. You had the native people, you had the Westminster Crown, and then you had these guys, pirates. 1835, this document was internationally recognised, and we'll go through it. We, the hereditary chiefs of the peoples of Nu Tireni. Now, a lot of people translate this as to we, the hereditary chiefs and the heads of tribes of the peoples of the northern parts of New Zealand. Nu Tireni is not New Zealand. This was done before New Zealand actually came into existence, although the land was at times called that. Nu Tireni is the name of the territory. Being assembled at Waitangi in the Bay of Islands, proclaim the sovereignty of our territory. Now, land can only be considered sovereign by the sovereigns who stand upon it. Because sovereignty is something only a living soul can carry. So when we stand as sovereigns in an area, that confers that upon that territory, which is hereby constituted and proclaimed to be of sovereign state of being, living in honour, under the designation of the Congress of Hapu of Nu Tireni. Now, a lot of you have heard trusts, iwi. These are commercial constructs that have been put in place to deceive. Okay? So the document is very specific. Hapu. So Article 1 is the proclamation of sovereign state. Article 2 is a constitutional order, because it's all very well having a proclamation or a declaration. It's who holds the responsibility, who has the responsibility of upholding that. Okay? All sovereign power and authority, or absolute power and authority if you like, within the territories of the Congress of Nu Tireni is hereby proclaimed to reside entirely and exclusively in the hereditary chiefs in our collective capacity. Because what we had in the run up to this time was Hapu, who then did an amazing thing. They actually sat down over 28 years. They decided they would actually come together because there was something out there that was much bigger than any of us. And it was literally the colonisation of humanity. Global colonisation, global slavery. Who will also proclaim that we will not permit any legislative authority separate from ourselves. Legislation, rules of an association. So what they're saying is we will not allow the imposition of somebody else's rules upon us unless we're in agreement with it. Okay? Because if we're not in agreement with it, then it's separate from us. It is not part of us because we're not in agreement with it. Nor any function of government to be exercised within the said territories unless by persons appointed by us and acting under the authority of laws regularly enacted by us in Congress assembled. This is probably the most profound piece of documentation I've come across in all my research. There is so much in this document and it fits on one piece of A4. And there's one thing the tupuna were very good at, being succinct. So, nor any function of government unless by persons appointed by us. Now that happened in 1840. When Victoria was given the privilege of governance. No sovereignty was ceded, because nobody can cede your sovereignty for you. Only you can do that. Okay. Because of the infrastructure, as you imagine, of now we have this invitation that was extended because a lot of our European lines were being hunted down and slaughtered by the oppressor, and have been done for thousands of years. Who's got Scottish ancestry? Know why they came here? Get away from it. They came here to the sanctuary that was offered our ancestors, that was offered by the tupuna here. That we could come here and once more expand our lines, because many of our lines were taken out to the sole survivor or taken out completely. Because a lot of the sovereign lines carried specific lines of knowledge. You know, when you remove knowledge from people, you've got slaves. Because it's ignorance that enslaves. So when you take the knowledge of people, one, and the one that's been taken away now is the knowledge of who you are. And that you have a right of self-determination. Absolute right. So, in 1840, Victoria was granted a privilege. Now, a privilege granted can be a privilege withdrawn. So the realm of New Zealand, which was meant to be established under the Westminster Crown operating under common law, worked in conjunction with the constitutional order here, but this is a jurisdiction that operates under the authority. Because the agreement of 1835 between our European ancestors and the tupuna, and hence the constitutional order, was that Hapu would always hold the authority on the land, on the territory, over the resources, right? Which, when you think of it, makes really good common sense. Because it's the people from that particular land that understand the rhythms of the land. You know? Who's been to Scotland? Oh, I hope to go one day. I hear they've got good Scotch. Yeah. I saw a picture of a tree in Scotland that was a couple hundred years old. It was about this high. Well, when you see the wind they get up there, you go, holy crap, no wonder. Yeah. I mean, the thing should be, framed, the fact that it's even alive in some of those areas. Now, if you can imagine that some of our forebears coming over to this land and stand there and look at a kauri tree, woo! Well, let's go and chop them down. Look, woo, 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 woo. 800 years, 1,000 years, that sentinel stood there. So we take what we need, use what we need, not take what we greed. So by having the native peoples holding the responsibility of the guardianship, the kaitiakitanga, the responsibility of the resources of the land, so when we borrow the land from our children, they have something when we pass on. Because one of the codes of the sovereign, if you like, is if I travel through this world and cannot leave it for the better of my having passed, then by what right did I even walk here? Because if it's not about the coming generations, what is it about? Because every time we recycle and incarnate through this physical dimension, surely we want it to be better the next time we come through. We seem to have forgotten that along the way. You know, when my dad bought his first house, it cost him 2 years' full wages. There was a new 3-bedroom brick and tile house in a subdivision in Auckland. In Mangere, actually, Mangere East, or as some people like to call it, Monterey, that's the other side. Now, it cost him 2 years' full wages. He was a fitter and turner, he was earning £2,500 a year, and it cost him £5,000. Now, a fitter and turner working today is earning about 60 odd G's a year. You cannot buy a brand new 3-bedroom brick and tile house in a new subdivision in Auckland for 120 G's. So why is it getting worse? Because logically it should be getting easier. Yeah? Remember the 5-day week? That meant now you're the 6 and 7 day week. You know? So that was one of the things that I really started having a look at with this and go, well, how come is, and so consequently it's worse for me, it's harder for me, it's harder for the next generation, and it's harder for even the generation after. We're getting a situation now where you've actually got talking about people about never actually even being able to own their own home. You know, a chook in a cage. Right. So our ancestors, in travelling around, because when they first came into contact, which was pre-1800s, and there were already a lot of Scots, of our Scottish ancestors in particular, already living over here, living with hapu. And of course they're communicating with each other. Why are you fellas here? Well, you want to see what's going over back home. You know? Because 1,000 years ago, the same disease that is now fermenting itself and becoming more and more we're becoming more and more in the grip of, 1,000 years ago, that was the same thing that took us off our lands in Scotland. And that was when I started researching my Scottish ancestry and my Germanic ancestry, you could, especially the Scottish, you could see the same parallels happening here, today. So our ancestors could see what was happening, because when our ancestors got together and sat down and talked, kanohi te kano, face to face, and we introduced our code, how we live by, and we agreed that given sanctuary here, that we would uphold this. We would respect this. This was an agreement. So that's all I'm doing, because I'm just standing to the agreement that our forebears put in place, because I see it as of a benefit to us. Now, if my grandfather and somebody else's great-grandfather make an agreement, that agreement is for them. They cannot foist that down through the generations, but if we see that that was an agreement that actually worked well for them, then we too can enact that agreement. I stand to that. So that's all we've done, is we've just enacted, if you like, the agreements that were already there. So Article 2 is the constitutional order. It is where the authority sits. Who holds the authority? Okay? It's all very well having a constitutional order. How is it going to be administered? By a rule of law, a rule of agreement. The hereditary chiefs agree to meet in Congress at Waitangi in the autumn of each year for the purpose of framing laws for the dispensation of justice, the preservation of peace and good order, and the regulation of trade. Yeah, sounds like the governing body to me, the authority to me. This is internationally recognised. This is not just some piece of fly-by-night paperwork. This is internationally recognised. So say 180 years ago. Now, who's involved with a club, like on a committee? Yeah. You've got to have a meeting once a year, at least once a year. You know, you have an AGM, usually. That holds that structure in place, if you like. Well, So too with our constitutional order. So, in their wisdom, our ancestors agreed that we would gather at Waitangi in the autumn of each year, which when you think of it is absolutely logical because that's when the harvest's in. You know? So that when you came together, you know, you could swap seeds, not just plant ones. And we cordially invite the southern tribes, because this document originally came from the north here, to lay aside their private animosities. Now this can be read in many ways or interpreted in many ways. This is actually a call to each individual. Put aside your private animosities. Okay. How many people hold animosity just because of colour? Or belief structures? You know? I mean, I've been in Hui where I've been vilified by people because of I'm a Pākehā. And when I said to one particular individual, have I ever done anything to cause you harm? Well, no, but your ancestors, whoa, back up the bus. Yeah, they might be related to me, but have I caused you harm? So why am I being vilified for that which is not my responsibility? How can I be responsible that was something that was done by my ancestors? The big question that people need to start asking is, what is the individual, what am I doing about the situation we have now? Because that's what's going to determine the reality. So they called upon the southern tribes to lay aside their private animosities. This is still open. This is absolutely open. Now what is interesting is Switzerland, it was very similarly set up like this under the, from the time of William Tell, when they arseholed the land barons out. And they took on their self-determination and they started determining and administering their own affairs in their cantons, or what we would call council areas, or what we would call rohi. And what they did was they combined together, the original four, to support each other with things that they couldn't provide for themselves and for things like protection. However, they still held the autonomy within their area. Now, Switzerland is still operating to that way today. I've been there, I lived there. My boy's mum is Swiss. Very interesting having a look at their structure. Everything is done by binding referendum. Probably only really the true democracy that exists. So these guys put aside, by saying that we call upon them to lay aside their private animosities and consult the safety of the welfare of our common territory by joining the Congress. What they're saying is that we in the north of the original 34 chiefs, which later on became 55, have already done that. We've laid aside our private animosities because they could see that they needed the unity to be able to stop the enslavement of humanity. Now, what I see happening around, of course, is there's still a lot of this animosity. And it is perpetrated through the media. A lot of it is orchestrated. But a lot of us that actually were born and grew up on this land, you know, I mean, when we went to school, we didn't have animosity. You either liked the guy or you didn't. Didn't matter what colour they were. So this rule of law is how the constitutional order is upheld. So the framing of laws. And that's done in that collective capacity in the structure of a Congress. Okay? Now, Article 4 comes through to international recognition. We also agreed to send a copy of this proclamation to His Majesty the King of England, who was William IV at the time, who was a king for 7 years, I think. Very, very switched on man. To thank him for his acknowledgement of our flag. International recognition. Here's a reigning monarch acknowledging us, acknowledging our flag. And in return, fair consideration. Okay? Agreement. And in return for the friendship and protection we have shown and are prepared to show to such of his subjects, those subject to his care and guidance, as have settled in our country or resorted to its shores for the purposes of trade, we entreat that he will continue to be the steward of our infant state, because we had just formed a whole new entity, if you like, which was the territory of Nu Tireni. Okay. Which, from talking to Kaumata and Kuia, the best translation I can get for that was a transliteration for new territory. Because what we had was these Rohi had agreed that they would hold their own autonomy within their areas, but they would also work collaboratively. And they held the responsibility for all that dwell within rohe. Whether you're subject to the jurisdiction of now Elizabeth or then Victoria, or whether you were a member of a hapu. So, and a steward, now a lot of people see in this translation of this as parent. A parent guides, a parent has authority over, right? Because that's your responsibility. You're not going to proclaim yourself to be of sovereign state and then ask for somebody to come and have authority over you. So, for me, the understanding our hapu have is the correct interpretation is steward. A steward is somebody that guides, awhis, helps. And that he will become its protector from all attempts upon its sovereignty. Now, as I say, this document is internationally recognised and it is in perpetuity. However, because it is a proclamation and only a living soul can hold a proclamation, because a proclamation is there as long as somebody's standing to it. Only a living soul can uphold a proclamation. What needed to happen was that as each of the tupuna who signed and became party to this agreement and proclaimed themselves a sovereign state and that they would live honourably, as they passed on, the one that stepped into that role of what we would call the rangatira of the hapu, representative of the hapu, who only stands there by the people who stand with them, okay, should have also proclaimed their continuing enactment of the document. That's what keeps it alive. Right? Documents in perpetuity, enactment is done on a generational basis. Because what it's saying is, we, this generation now, agree with this document, agree with the intent of this, and we stand to it, and thus we enact it. Now, that hadn't been done for well over 100 years until this year, when it was actually done. And what that did was that reinstated the sovereign order in this territory. Now, if anybody wants to disagree with that, the proclamations are open for rebuttal. Because we had 3 hapu who had proclaimed the right of self-determination, proclaimed themselves to be of sovereign state, because you can't uphold a proclamation unless that's what you're going to be. A proclamation of sovereignty, unless you proclaim that yourself. And we proclaimed our enactment of the 1835, He Whakaputanga, and our honouring and upholding of the 1840, which is another agreement of our ancestors that they put together, so that we could live in peace and harmony with each other, and all share in absolute abundance, under the auspices and the guidance and the care of those who understood how the land operates. Because you had people come to our place over in Scotland, they might want to go, oh, there's a bit of fire, oh man, you know, took 200 years for that tree to get that high. So it's by having the authority held by the people of the land, because they understand the rhythms of the land, they understand the weather patterns, they understand the whole rhythm of it, because they're in tune with it. A lot of us have become disenfranchised or separated from our land, or the land of our forebears.